I would like to thank you, Anna, for your presentation. And as Hanka said, we will be talking about OECD and strategic and innovative public procurement. Some of you already know Erika Bozaj. She is a lawyer with experience from public administration, for example, from the Hungarian Ministry of the Interior, who has, for the 9th year, been active in the Infrastructure and Public Procurement Division of OECD as a senior advisor for strategies.
I would like to ask you to join us, and whether you want to sit here or here, please welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. And it's really nice to be back to Prague. One of my last conferences before the COVID-19 crisis was basically here. So it's good to be back and see some familiar faces and also new faces. As Adam already introduced me, I'm a senior policy advisor from the OECD, from the Infrastructure and Public Procurement Office. I hope OECD doesn't really need an introduction, but just for those who are not really familiar with OECD, it's an international organization which is based in Paris, France, and our motto is better policies for better lives. So we are working closely with OECD members on supporting them, creating better policies, and of course the cooperation, sharing information, and good practices is integral part of our work. We have 38 members and 5 key partners, and these members are covering basically the whole world. And of course, the Czech Republic is also a member in the OECD, basically since 1995. And I also would like to mention that the European Union has also a permanent delegation to the OECD. So in this regard, we also have a really close cooperation with the European Commission. For example, for public procurement, we have a special working party, and the European Commission is also a member, not just in the working party, but even in the leadership of this working party. And at OECD, as I mentioned, we are working closely with OECD countries and non-OECD countries as well, developing international standards, also conducting peer reviews, so conducting assessments, reviews of national public procurement systems. Sometimes we are focusing not on the whole public procurement system, but on some sectors or specific topics, depending on the request of our partner countries, because we are doing these reviews always on the request of OECD members, which also means that we are tailoring these kind of assessments, reviews to the specific needs of the countries. And I guess most of you know OECD from that angle, that we are publishing big reports from time to time on different topics, not just in public procurement, but in other topics as well. So we are collecting data, information, evidence on procurement performance and impact, and trying to analyze all this data and issue a structured report on these topics to show present, current trends, and maybe even give some foresights for the future. we have some thematic work when we are focusing on specific topics. For example, recently we focused on how to integrate responsible business conduct in public procurement. This is just a nice feedback to the previous session when due diligence was mentioned extensively. So this was also a topic that we looked at more recently, how OECD members are approaching this topic. But we also issued a report on green public procurement, or how to promote better SME access to public procurement markets, or what kind of policies are in place to support innovation and public procurement. Or more recently, we looked at more closely gender-responsive public procurement. Beyond these big thematic works and reports, which are, again, approaching a topic from this comparative angle and trying to look at all the OECD countries or what the OECD countries are doing, we are also working closely with countries on a bilateral basis. And based on the request, we are either doing some reviews of the public procurement system. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we had a big collaboration with Germany and did a review of the public procurement system. We looked at different angles of the public procurement system, but we also looked at how the OECD well-being framework can be applied to the public procurement system in Germany. We also have a lot of cooperation, collaboration, for example, with Slovakia. I saw colleagues from Slovakia in the participants, or amongst the participants. For example, recently we had a collaboration with Slovakia where we focused not on the whole public procurement system, but the procurement of ICT products and services. And maybe it's also important to mention that we are not only working with, let's say, the national government level, but we can also work with regions and cities as well. And this is really important because, as you know, that in average, in OECD countries, 2/3 of public procurement is happening on this sub-national level. So it's really important how regions and cities are implementing public procurement legislation, what are their approaches to public procurement. And for example, an example for a regional level cooperation is from Portugal. We worked with the Central region to support the region with its ambition on using public procurement to support the transition to circular economy. Or an example for a city-level cooperation coming again from Slovakia, we had a collaboration with the city of Bratislava, focusing on the strategic use of public procurement, and had a case study on how to improve the city lighting system in Bratislava. And these collaborations are focusing not only to do some kind of review and assessment of the current system, so do a stock taking of the current situation, but also to set up some recommendations to improve the situation. And last but not least, recently we are focusing more and more also on providing hands-on support to either public procurement offices, policymakers, or even individual contracting authorities, and also developing some practical tools that can help to translate all these important principles into the practice. And as I mentioned, we are also developing some international standards. The main standard in public procurement is the OECD recommendation on public procurement, which was adopted by the OECD Council in 2015. And this recommendation is basically the basis for any kind of work that OECD is carrying out on public procurement. It includes 12 integrated principles, and this recommendation promotes the strategic use of public procurement. I would like to talk a little bit later about one of the principles, which is called balance. And I think this was already mentioned in the previous sessions, because it closely linked to our topic on strategic public procurement. And also just one word about this recommendation. It doesn't look like, for example, it's the EU directives. It's not a detailed codex for public procurement. It rather includes all those important principles which are relevant for a well-governed public procurement system. And we also looked at more closely how OECD members are implementing this public procurement recommendation in the practice and issued a report about it. And not surprisingly, of course, one of the topics that we looked at more closely is the strategic use of public procurement. We published a report and also a shorter summary of the findings under the title of highlights. These are available on our website, so you can look at it. And of course, the question is why we are talking so much about public procurement. Again, I think some numbers already mentioned also in the introduction about the economic importance of public procurement in the Czech Republic. But also, if we look at the numbers on OECD level, you can see that on average in OECD countries, 12% of GDP is spent through public procurement. And we also heard in the previous interventions that the COVID-19 crisis further demonstrated the role and the importance of public procurement, because everybody was rushing to procure essential goods and services which were needed for the prevention of COVID. And we also see that this really important and relevant role of public procurement remains with us in most of the countries, OECD countries and EU countries. A huge amount of public money is reserved for supporting the recovery after COVID-19. And again, most of this money will be spent through public procurement. As I mentioned, we looked at what is happening in terms of strategic public procurement in OECD countries. And what we can see that most of the OECD countries are using public procurement in a strategic way, especially to support the green and digital transitions. And more recently, they also started to put much more focus on the social dimension. What is really promising that policy and regulatory frameworks for the strategic use of public procurement are in place in most of the OECD countries. So in this regard, there are regulatory frameworks which are enabling contracting authorities, public buyers to be more strategic in their public procurement. There are dedicated strategies as well in most of the countries. There are also different supporting programs in place in most of the countries. So countries are putting more and more focus on the implementation of these policy and regulatory frameworks in the form of supporting public buyers with publishing guidelines and other supporting tools. So the capacity building is also more and more or higher and higher on the agenda in the countries. What is still a little bit lagging behind is the monitoring part of this exercise. Because even if we have nice strategies and policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks, if there is no monitoring, so there is no follow-up how all these kind of objectives are implemented in the practice, then countries cannot really understand whether public procurement is a really useful tool for pursuing these strategic objectives. So monitoring frameworks are still, again, missing, maybe not entirely, but this is one of those elements where further work should be done to really benefit from this strategic use of public procurement. And if we look at the different OECD countries and try to understand what are those strategic goals that they try to address through public procurement, then we can see that there is a huge diversity of the different policy objectives, including, of course, sustainability, but including also the transition to circular economy, or supporting the digital transformation, or promoting the better access of SMEs to public procurement, or social inclusion, regional development, and I think we can still continue the list. I don't want to go into the details because this is just a kind of evidence that most of the OECD countries are using public procurement in a strategic way. But I would like to somehow highlight here that OECD is currently conducting a new survey on green public procurement. The last really comprehensive data collection happened in 2018. So we saw that it's now time to collect new data on the implementation of green public procurement in OECD countries. We already received the data and the information from the countries, and currently we are analyzing this data, and also would like to, of course, structure all this data and analysis in a nice report. We will share the preliminary results of the survey basically next week at our OECD Working Party meeting on public procurement. But these are still just preliminary results. But again, we really would like to understand whether there is progress, for example, in terms of data collection in countries, in monitoring of the implementation of green public procurement. We also would like to understand more how they approach this discussion on voluntary or mandatory green public procurement approaches. So this is also part of this survey. And again, when it comes to the strategic use of public procurement, of course, public procurement is also a tool to achieve SDGs. There is even a specific goal, 12.7, which is mentioning public procurement as an important tool to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in most of the OECD countries, they are also setting up strategies for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, and of course include public procurement into these strategies. And as I mentioned earlier, when we are talking about the strategic use of public procurement, I guess we are talking a lot about green public procurement, so using public procurement to fight against climate change and other challenges in this regard. But we talk maybe less, or at least in the past, talked less about the social dimension of this strategic use of public procurement and the social dimension of sustainability. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2012 and 2020, and 2021, and I lost the presentation. Yes, 21. We had a program where we focused specifically on how to integrate responsible business conduct in public procurement. This was a joint initiative with another directorate in OECD. So we had a collaboration with those colleagues who are focusing on responsible business conduct and who are working closely, let's say, with the business sector and focusing on these aspects. And when we are talking about responsible business conduct, it includes different considerations, including considerations around environment and integrity, but also consideration about human rights, labor rights, minorities, gender, unemployment, and disability. And as usual, we did a big stock-taking exercise to understand what the OECD countries are doing in this regard. We also developed some policy briefs on special topics. And what is more important, we had a pilot where we worked closely with public buyers from different OECD countries and focused on the specific topic on how to incorporate due diligence in the procurement of garment, because we picked up this purchasing category. And again, it's a nice echo what Anna said, that when it comes to due diligence, it's also really important to focus on specific sectors which are much more prone to human rights abuses, labor rights abuses, and other similar problems and challenges, and that's why we picked up the garment sector, and also because OECD worked a lot in this sector, and there is even a specific guidance on how to apply due diligence in this sector. But of course, during this pilot, we wanted to understand what does it mean for the public buyers if there is any kind of obligation on incorporating due diligence into these procurements. I would like to highlight just a few findings from this report, because I think there are two main issues that was not a big surprise to us, but definitely was those findings where we would like to work more in the future. One of the main findings that these kind of RBC considerations rarely apply to the supply chain. So public buyers setting up, of course, requirements which apply to the main contractors, to the main suppliers, but they usually don't really set up requirements for the subcontractors and don't really know what is happening in the supply chain. And we also know that in several sectors there is a quite huge supply chain who is also indirectly participating, of course, in the performance of the contract. So it's also really important to know what is happening in this supply chain. The other important finding was that we looked at specifically how central purchasing bodies are dealing with this issue. And again, here what we see that they are trying to put more emphasis on looking at the supply chain, but they are also still lagging behind. So this is what we would like to focus more in the future, to also focus on the supply chains. And why it is important? Because, of course, governments can set up high responsible standards and requirements in their tender requirements, which apply directly, of course, to the suppliers, but it can also impact the whole production patterns throughout the supply chains, and at the end of the day, it can also impact consumption patterns. We published a policy brief on this topic, where we looked at how or what are the direct benefits for governments to incorporate all these kind of requirements into public procurement. And now just a few words about this principle of balance that I already mentioned earlier. And basically, it nicely echoes what was already said in the introduction and also by Anna, that, of course, it's really important to recognize that public procurement can be a strategic policy tool that can help governments to advance with a lot of strategic policy objectives. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget about, let's say, the primary procurement objectives. So we also need to provide the necessary public services in a timely, effective, and efficient way. And that's why the OECD recommendation on public procurement suggests this balanced approach for governments and also for public buyers in regarding strategic public procurement. So it's really important to always evaluate whether public procurement is the best option to pursue this particular strategic objective, or maybe there are some other policy tools that can be applied in this regard. So again, on the one hand, we promote the strategic use of public procurement as widely as possible, but at the same time, we shouldn't forget that public procurement can be a miracle tool for everything. And that's why it's also really important to develop a strategy, understanding how public procurement can really support these kind of national strategies. And what is also really important, that this strategy, of course, should include some kind of prioritization. And then it's always really important to assess the impact of the resulting actions. And these are my last slides. I just would like to really briefly summarize what we see based on the work with different OECD countries, what strategic public procurement really requires. I think it's really important to set up the adequate legal and policy framework. And as I mentioned, this is already in place in most of the OECD countries. It's also really important to undertake a stock-taking of national priorities and goals related to the economic, environmental, and social policies. I already mentioned the importance of developing a strategy. But it's also really important here that a strong political commitment is really important for the strategic use of public procurement. It should be ensured during the strategy development, but also later during the implementation of this strategy. And what is also really important, that of course we need to involve also all the relevant stakeholders, including the market players, because at the end of the day, they will, of course, those who submit proposals, tenders to public procurement notices, so they should also be aware of all these kind of initiatives. What is also really important is the planning. So it's really important to develop a proper planning mechanism. It's really important to set up target outcomes and milestones. These are really important because we need to assess whether the strategic objectives are achieved against these targets. And if we don't have targets and milestones, then we cannot really achieve the progress. And of course, this requires monitoring. And this is what I already mentioned, that this is where we still see some challenges in most of the OECD countries. And of course, to do a proper monitoring, countries also need monitoring systems, which include detailed performance indicators. And of course, it also requires comprehensive reporting from contracting authorities, public buyers. And I guess it's always a big challenge how we can set up these kind of reporting obligations without adding additional burden on the side of the contracting authorities. And here, of course, digital transformation of public procurement can be really helpful to collect all this data. And what can be also important, that there are different internationally accepted tools which can also help countries to assess where they are standing, for example, with sustainable public procurement. I don't know if you are familiar with the methodology for assessing procurement systems. With the abbreviation, it's called MAPS, and it has a special module on sustainable public procurement. Again, it can be one of those tools that can be used. Capacity building and scaling up the institutions and also the individuals in the different institutions are really important. Again, both institutional and individual learning is really important. And when we are talking about capacity building, of course, it should include not only the procurement professionals who are really dealing with developing procurement strategies and tender tender documents, but also other stakeholders in the public procurement system, including those who are dealing with control or audit of the public procurement procedures, or those who are working at the review bodies. Communities of practice is a really important element in this regard. They can be really powerful to share information and share good practices. And I didn't mention on the slide, but also competency centers can be really important elements. I don't want to go into the details, just wanted to highlight that we are working currently on a policy paper about professionalization of the public procurement workforce. In the recent years, we had several collaboration with OECD countries, but also with the European Commission on focusing on different aspects of professionalization. And we are trying to summarize all those lessons learned from these projects that are relevant for professionalization. And last but not least, what I would like to highlight here is the need for collaboration with the business sector, because without the business sector, any initiative on strategic procurement, public procurement cannot be really successful. So it's really important to understand the market solutions and the market capacity. So that's why it's really important to have this strategic engagement with the market, including the importance of preliminary market engagement before individual public procurement processes, but also on a more, let's say, strategic level. And also, it's really important to ensure sustainability in the whole supply chain, so look beyond the main contractors. And this is the last slide. What is the legacy of COVID? What we see that in most of the countries, although digitalization in public procurement was already well advanced in most of the countries before COVID, but what we saw that during the COVID, this digitalization was even enhanced, and it covers now the whole public procurement process, or at least there are initiatives to cover the whole public procurement process, and also to integrate it better with other, let's say, subsystems in the public financial management system or public governance systems in the countries. We also see an increased attention to risk management approaches, better use of strategic sourcing, and as I already mentioned, accelerated professionalization strategies in almost all of the OECD countries, and also, for example, at the level of the European Commission, which is also putting more and more focus on professionalization. And this is where I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you. And before I open the floor for the questions from the audience, I would like to highlight, let's say, two points that you have made during your presentation, which is focused also on capacity building of the people, of the persons who are responsible for the revision, for the review, for controlling authorities, which actually might be part of discussion later today. And the second one, which was quite important from my point of view, is the prioritization as a very important part of tackling the strategic public procurement. Because in general, what is strategic public procurement or a strategic approach to public procurement? I might be asking, is there any, let's say, a complete list what strategic procurement actually means, or is it more basically a decision of the nation or decision of the contracting authority which aims, which goals are included in this strategic approach?
Thank you. So your first question was about the professionalization.
That was just more like a remark, yes. And I'm thankful for that. And the second one is really what actually does include.
Okay, thank you, because this is what I wanted to ask. That I know that you made a comment on professionalization, but I don't remember the question, but there was no question. Yes, so I don't think that there is a list of these kind of strategic objectives and that you can just simply copy in your own national strategy. I think it's really important to set up these kind of priorities and also strategies on a national level. And that's why I try to somehow also explain that public procurement should serve the really important national policy strategies of a country. So it's, we don't set up the strategic objectives just for the sake of public procurement, but rather public procurement should be looked at as a tool that can support the implementation of the government's or the country's strategic objectives. And that's why I also mentioned that whenever you are trying to set up a strategy for the strategic use of public procurement or sustainable public procurement, the first what is important to do is to do this stock taking of the national priorities. And of course, all of the countries are either members of the EU or they have international commitments. So these priorities will be also influenced by all those kind of international commitments that a country made. And then, of course, it's also always really important to take into account not just these kind of national strategies, but as I mentioned, also looking at what the market is can offer in terms of these kind of strategic public procurement. And last but not least, I think it's important to introduce some kind of step-by-step approach and phasal approach. So you don't really want to tackle everything at the same time, but rather focusing on some priorities. And I think it also applies to the individual contracting authorities, who of course need to then align their own approaches with this national strategy. But it's always good if they can also get some kind of discretion in terms of these kind of approaches. And that's why I think again, it's a question around introducing mandatory requirements or rather setting up some kind of targets. And of course, if you set up targets, the question how you set up the target, whether it's a 100% GPP target. And I guess we have some colleagues from Lithuania, from the Public Procurement Office, and they have some experience on this 100% GPP target. So again, it's important to set up these targets because then it also gives the opportunity for the contracting authorities to align their own internal strategies, policies, practices gradually to these kind of targets. Because, as we mentioned, not all of the goods or services are suitable for example, incorporate either green aspects or incorporate circularity. So that's why this prioritization is really, really important.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, making 100% of your procurement green or sustainable might be really tricky. There are representatives of Slovakia who went a different way and set the bar a little lower on 6%, as far as I know. I would like to turn to the audience. Is there any question regarding OECD and their actions in strategic public procurement? I can't see any raised hand, so maybe one more question. You mentioned collaboration of OECD with the countries and even different stakeholders. As far as I know, there were at least 4 projects between OECD and Slovakia, partners in Slovakia, including the national level, including cooperation with Bratislava. And if we are talking about cooperation with between OECD and contracting authority, what does it actually mean? How does it look like? What is the program? How long does it take? And what are the outcomes, for instance, of this kind of collaboration?
Yes. Well, it's a really complex question in that sense that, of course, it always depends on the project itself. And we have different type of projects. But for example, the projects that you mentioned in Slovakia, but of course, we also have similar projects with other EU countries, usually of 2 years long, 2 or a little bit more. And again, it really much depends on what is the scope of the project. Recently, in the collaboration with Slovakia, we usually did some kind of stock taking of, let's say, practices on ICT procurement, or in the city of Bratislava on how they are really using public procurement in a strategic way. And then the project also included some kind of pilot projects. So we worked closely with contracting authorities and tested some kind of approaches, guidelines in the practice in that real-life public procurement procedure that the contracting authority put forward to us. So I would say that this project includes an element which is much more about doing some kind of analysis on a special topic, setting up some kind of recommendations on the way forward. And then there is also a more practical element of this project, which includes the development of some kind of practical tools, guidelines. And then we also try to test these draft guidelines tools in the practice to understand whether it really fits in the specific context of the special country. And for this testing, we are collaborating with individual contracting authorities doing this kind of pilot. But again, there are so many different type of collaborations. I mentioned this collaboration with Portugal, with one of the regions, where we work together with the managing authority and with a group of contracting authorities, because they had a regional action plan on circular economy, and public procurement was one of the tools that they, of course, identified as a tool that can support the transition to circular economy. And then there were a few contracting authorities in the region who volunteered to conduct at least 2 public procurement procedures where they incorporate circularity in the tender procedure. And they picked up school food procurement. And then we worked together with this group of contracting authorities and also with the managing authority, organized some capacity building workshops to understand how these kind of circularity elements can be incorporated in the tender procedure. Also invited peers, experts from other OECD countries. For example, Copenhagen is one of the front runners in terms of incorporating circularity in school food or food procurement. So they were invited, they shared their information. And it was not just about capacity building, but we also provided support to the preparation of the tender procedures and the tender documentation. And if I may just say one last sentence, and again, echoing what Anna said, we really much promote the importance of the preparatory stage of public procurement. This is that stage where a lot of important decisions are made. And this is that stage where you really need to understand the needs of those who the public procurement is made for, but also we really need to understand the market itself, what the market can offer to us. And of course, public buyers should be ambitious when they are setting up their requirements, but at the end of the day, they don't want to set up too strict and high-level requirements, which cannot be really performed by any of the business players in the market. And of course, this kind of market engagement is also a good opportunity to somehow communicate to the market that there are these sustainability ambitions on the side of the public buyers. So they would like to go beyond to purchase the cheapest product, the cheapest available product. So that's why this kind of market engagement is really important. And this is what we are also somehow promoting in these works, and also supporting not just the, let's say, contracting authorities and public procurement offices to promote the importance and relevance of market engagement, but as you mentioned, and I also mentioned earlier in my presentation, it's really important to have this understanding from the control and audit bodies and the review bodies, because basically this kind of dialogue with the market is something which is really different from those concepts that I think most of those public procurement actors studied, who started their work, let's say, 15 years ago or even 10 years ago. I think this kind of market dialogue was not really well accepted. So it's also a kind of change in the approaches. That's why, again, it's really important to have this kind of wide cooperation.
Thank you very much. And since the title of the conference is Current Trends, let me just ask you one last very quick question, very quick answer. What are basically the current trends? If you could, you mentioned some of those, the trends in public procurement. So which are the current trends? So what's ahead of us? What's ahead of contracting authorities? What should they be focusing on? Which are the most relevant trends in sustainable or strategic public procurement these days?
It's a really difficult question, and it's really difficult to reply in one sentence. But I think, again, as I mentioned, green public procurement is still high on the agenda in most of the countries. But what we see that the social responsibility part and the social dimension of sustainability is also getting more and more attention from countries. And for example, we have more and more requests from OECD countries to look at much closer the labor rights and human rights in public procurement, as I mentioned. But I couldn't pick up, one trend. Again, I think it should be looked at from this holistic perspective, and then following the national strategic objectives and also understanding the specificities of the product category or service category, which is subject matter of the individual public procurement procedure, what can be really achieved or pursued within that public procurement procedure.
So thank you very much indeed for sharing your presentation and answering the questions. Thank you very much.